welcome to Cut Loose. And if you're new to the channel, my name's Martin. And on this channel, we're attempting to tell some of the stories and adventures of life after retirement. In this particular case, I think it's the third or fourth of my Wicken Fen playlist. And this is largely surrounding the management of Wicken Fen.
The management of Wicken Fen is varied, but basically it follows two different forms. There's the management of the undrained and ancient fen. This is the bit that most people know of as Wicken Fen, and where all the designations where it's internationally important. And then there's the management of the newer land. These are the bits of the reserve that have been created from sort of redundant and ex-arable land. These are the areas that we're now attempting to rewild in some form. But to start off with, it's perhaps worth telling the story of how Wicken Fen sort of got to where it is today. Although we tend to think of Wicken Fen in the context of the years from 1899 when the National Trust got involved, Wicken Fen as a landscape has existed for several thousand years. Following the last ice age, as water levels increased, this also included sea levels, what we now know as the Fen Basin became increasingly waterlogged. Eventually, the major rivers that flow through the area, the Nene, the Great Ouse, the Welland and the Witham, could no longer empty out into what was once a huge river valley. We now know it as the North Sea, but that water could now not escape. Of course, the water had to go somewhere, and it basically filled up the basin of low-lying land, which we now know as the fens. Now, over the next 5,000 years or so, these now extensive wetlands stretched to some 3,800 square kilometres. Now, this huge wetland, this huge lake, started to colonise with wetland vegetation, not unnaturally. Over the years and through the cycles, this aquatic vegetation died off, sank to the bottom, it started to get compacted and then started to form peat. Now, over the centuries, the peat got deeper and deeper and the water got shallower and shallower, until eventually the peat started to emerge from the surface of the water, particularly during drier periods in the summer months. Now, in very simple terms, this is what we now refer to as fen habitat. And the definition is land that is partially inundated through the sort of winter months, but becomes exposed during the summer months. Now, this situation existed across the entire 3,800 square kilometres of the Fen Basin for many centuries. Now, around these margins, it offered opportunities for some sort of subsistence farming. This was quite sporadic, and attempts at land drainage were not greatly successful. Now, by the 17th century, the Crown and a number of wealthy capitalists, including the Duke of Bedford and several other wealthy people, and these were known as gentlemen adventurers. And these groups recognised the potential of this area as a food production, providing they could get it drained. Now, later on in the 17th century, these gentlemen adventurers employed the services of a Dutch engineer called Cornelius Vermuyden. Now, Vermuyden adopted a system of extensive drainage ditches and river diversions to make all this drainage possible. One of the great successes was to redirect the River Great Ouse into what we now know as the Old and the New Bedford rivers. Now, the drainage of the fens is probably a vlog for another time, but it helps to set the scene in how Wicken Fen came into being. But needless to say, those drainage of the fens greatly reduced the biodiversity. And this biodiversity had been developing over several millennia. So that by the end of the 19th century, what had once been a wetland 3,800 square kilometres in extent had now been reduced to a number of small pockets, none of which extended beyond around about 80 hectares, which in old money is less than 200 acres. In very simple terms, it meant that over 99.9% of this lovely important and diverse habitat had been lost. This great loss has been described by Dr. Ian Rotherham in his book, The Lost Fens, as England's greatest ecological disaster. So by the end of the 19th century, this great loss of biodiversity was being recognised. And in 1895, a renowned entomologist by the name of Herbert Goss raised the matter, and I quote, "of some concern for the loss of Wicken Fen, the haunt of much wildlife." 4 years later, the National Trust, then only itself in its fourth year, purchased its first 2 acres of Wicken Fen for the princely sum of £10. And so began the slow and steady saving and conservation of the remaining wetlands at Wicken. And this now represents the oldest nature reserve in England. Now, most people probably don't really appreciate what's involved in nature conservation and the management of nature reserves. And Wicken Fen itself, when you look at the management, it can be quite complicated. Now, in very simple terms, all conservation management is set to halt the natural succession of habitats and landscapes. Now, we as humans have a set of desired stages and phases and habitats that we really like. Now, these tend to be areas that provide the habitat for the species that we hold dear. Now, in many respects, that's where we are with the management of Wicken Fen Nature Reserve, because it is one of the few remaining tiny fragments of the once enormous wet fens. This means that a lot of the species that do occur at Wicken Fen can only be found at Wicken Fen, and therefore makes them very vulnerable. This means that we have obligations, both moral and legal, to make sure that we give these species every opportunity to survive. In the meantime, the National Trust is extending the nature reserve by reverting ex and redundant arable land. To date, the methods that have been employed to do this have been quite novel in creating a sustainable landscape. That landscape is also dynamic and ever-changing, but it helps the landscape develop in a much more natural way. It is, in fact, a form of rewilding. Now, as I've mentioned, the management at Wicken Fen is quite varied, and sometimes it can be quite complex, but it does go on through the year. This management falls into two main categories, I suppose. The first is the management of the old parts of the fen, the ancient parts of the fen, the bits that have got most of the designations. Now, this can be quite intensive. It requires quite a lot of resource, both human and equipment, and it mainly entails halting that successional process at a desired point. And for us, that desired point is to secure the habitats that hold a lot of the important species that call Wicken Fen home. The second method is a much more extensive form of management. It's more flexible, it's more dynamic. In effect, it really doesn't have an end point. Now, this method adopts a much more relaxed approach to conservation management. It doesn't set out to arrest natural succession. In fact, it embraces it as one of the main drivers of habitat development. It allows the natural processes to really run their course. And in so doing, we like to think it's going to give us a much more natural landscape, and one that's sustainable into the future. Taking the management of the old fen first, the one that has the more prescriptive approach, is definitely a more conventional form of conservation management, and the one that's most widely used in Britain. Primarily, it follows sort of traditional forms of land management, those forms of land management that have been used through the ages. Now, I've mentioned the halting of the successional process several times, and basically what that means is you hold the development of the habitat at a particular point, and to do that you cut the vegetation down. Now, that could be cutting down hay, it could be cutting down trees, but in effect you're removing the next stage in the development process and holding it at that particular phase that is seen as desirable. Now, at Wicken Fen, this has been going on since at least the 14th, 15th century, where sedge was being harvested as a material that was used primarily for putting on roofs. Now, back in those days, all the work was carried out by hand and used to involve pretty much the entire family coming and gathering in that harvest. So this is how things remained right up until the mid-20th century, around about the mid-50s. And then things started to get mechanised. Things like the Mayfield cutter here certainly speeded up the process. And then we started to see tractors appearing on the scene with this Massey Ferguson 35. And developments in mowing equipment and hay turners also helped to speed up the process. Now, one of the things Wicken's always been very good at is keeping up with the technology, and as technology developed, so did our tractors. But then eventually we got to this point. This particular piece of kit is the LogLogic Soft Track, and we acquired it in the early 21st century. It speeds up the job enormously. Not only is it quicker actually doing the job, but it also cuts and collects as it goes, so we don't have to keep going over the same piece of ground several times to gather up the horizons. These are all thrown into the bin at the back, which we then put off into Duffy piles. Now, Duffy piles have a distinct ecological value all their own. In a lot of places, this material, basically compost, is removed from site, but at Wicken we keep it in these big piles, and they provide particular ecological conditions that don't occur anywhere else on the site. They provide a home for particular invertebrates, they provide a home for snakes and other reptiles through the winter, and are a valuable part of the Wicken Fen's ecology. Now, as the saying goes, there's more than one way to skin a cat, and that's how it is with the management of Wicken Fen. We've just seen how we manage the tall herb fen, the fen meadows, but there are lots of other things that we have to do as part of the prescriptions within the management plan. We have a grazing regime on Verrill's Fen. We have a coppicing programme to make sure that the woodlands are always in good condition. And then there's visitor access, making sure the boardwalk's safe and up to scratch, making sure the footpaths are all in good condition and the signs are easily understandable. We have to manage the condition of the ditches. We have two processes that undertake this work. One's called slubbing and one's called brinking. Slubbing is where we remove detritus from several years from the bottom of the ditch to stop it succeeding to dry ground. And brinking is where we cut the vegetation right over the edge of the ditch, so that dragonflies, for instance, can find the water in the spring when they want to lay their eggs. Now, you'll have noticed as we've gone through the story of Wicken Fen that on a lot of the video there are various places. There are patches of scrub. This is wetland scrub, also known as carr, C-A-R-R. And at Wicken Fen, it forms a very, very important part of the fen community. And although very important, can also be quite destructive. If it were to get out of control, it would spread across the whole of the fen, and a lot of the important species that Wicken Fen is home to would disappear. We therefore have to keep it in check. Now, over recent decades, particularly towards the end of the 20th century, we embarked on and completed some fairly major projects to reduce the amount of carr on the sedge fen. In effect, we took it from having a 75% coverage of carr to having around about 30 to 40% coverage of carr. This has allowed the regeneration of the characteristic fenland plants and habitats, which was the very thing that the National Trust set out to conserve way back in 1899 when it bought its first 2.5 acres of Wicken Fen. But without a doubt, the greatest challenge that we face at Wicken Fen is managing the water levels. Wicken Fen is a wetland, so it needs lots of water, but it has to be the right sort of water. In other words, it has to be calcareous water or groundwater. We get water to various parts of the nature reserve in a number of ways, but on the undrained fen, on the old fen, we have two wind pumps. Now, these two wind pumps are not difficult to see at all. One's alongside Wicken Lode, and the other is visible from the visitor centre. These pump water onto the sedge fen through the winter. We have licences from the Environment Agency to do this, and this helps to keep the right balance in the water chemistry. Wicken Fen is a calcareous habitat, which means it's alkaline. A lot of people think that because it's peat based it's actually acid. Well, it's not. It's the opposite. And as rainwater is naturally acidic, the wind pumps help to buffer this and prevent it turning into an acid community. Well, that covers a lot of how the undrained fen is managed, the sedge fen's managed. But that still leaves our newer land to describe. That's going to take quite a lot of time, so I think what I'll do is I'll call a halt there, and I'll do a separate video covering the newer land, the rewilding. If you've enjoyed this or you found it interesting, then think about subscribing. And if you want to see about the rewilding, then click the old bell to get notifications. And as I say, if you've enjoyed it, then give us a bit of a thumbs up. Okay then, till next time, cheerio.